In today's globalized economy, you might be an American doing business in Rwanda, a French woman making a deal with Japan, or an Argentine trying to woo a new customer in Australia. You can do your business over the phone via Skype or hop on a plane. That's the easy part. The tough part is figuring out how to conduct yourself in a different culture. Is it Americans who don't like criticism and Germans who don't want you to mince words, or is it the other way around? And do you bow or not bow with your Japanese counterparts? Erin Meyer is a professor at INSEAD, an international business school with campuses all over the world. She is the author of The Culture Map. So, Americans are fascinated by the world, but what we really want to know is what do they think of us? Right. In this map, what are the traits that you think of? And you live in France now, so you have a good perspective. What are the traits that people think of as distinctively American when it comes to doing business and interacting?
Well, one thing that you brought up a moment ago was this tendency to give a lot of positive feedback. And that might come off as being superficial or just confusing to people from other countries. So as you said, I've lived in France now for 15 years. And in France, people are trained to give positive feedback a lot more implicitly and to give negative feedback a lot more bluntly than we do in the U.S. And I worked with a French client a while ago who had moved to the U.S. She had a new American boss. Her American boss called her into his office to tell her that her performance was unacceptable. But he started by telling her, in the way we do in the U.S., the things he felt she was doing well. And then by the time he got to the real message, she wasn't even listening anymore. She left that meeting thinking, wow, this was the best feedback I've ever received. So leaders today need to be, managers, all of us, need to be really aware of these cultural differences.
And flip it around. So if an American goes to France or Germany, they will tend to, they give a presentation, and the German might say, well, these were the 4 things I didn't like about what you do. Oh, he'd be right, blunt, and upfront about the disagreement, right?
It could be very surprising for an American, and when you're first getting used to it, it can be unsettling.
And what do you think of as some of the other dominant characteristics that, in other countries that people should be aware of? For example, if you're doing business in China, what would be the kind of key Chinese cultural, traits?
Well, one might be, when should you speak and when should you be quiet? And that's a very simple thing that we learn in our own cultural environment when we're children. I had a team I was working with recently where I had a group of Americans and 1 Chinese on the team. The Americans were all jumping in, talking on top of each other, and the Chinese person just sat quietly. Afterwards, I asked them how the meeting had gone. One of the Americans had said, well, this Chinese guy, he doesn't have anything to contribute. He's really shy. And I spoke to the Chinese, and he said, well, I can't find an opportunity to speak in all of this, this chaos and jumping in. Just knowing when to be quiet can help.
A friend of mine who has a CEO who has operations in India and China, and I asked him, what's the big difference? He said, well, in China, it's very hard to get the managers to talk frankly and explicitly about what the problems they face are. And I said, what's the problem in India? He said, in India, it's the opposite problem. I can't get them to shut up.
Exactly.
And so now, how would you, the map is itself quite complex. How would you explain to people what are the tools you need to navigate this? Obviously, ideally, everyone would be an expert in the cultures of all these places, but that's going to be difficult. So what are the simple rules one can apply?
One of the rules is that the way that you perceive another culture may be very different than the way that another culture perceives that culture. So if you're working in a global organization, you have to understand cultural relativity. Just to give you an example of this, I worked with a British and a French team a while ago, and I asked the British at one point, what's it like to work with the French? And the British said to me, well, Erin, you know the French. They're really chaotic, they're always late, they're really disorganized. A little bit later, I had a group from India who joined the same team, and I asked the Indians after a little while, what's it like to work with the French? And the Indians said to me, well, Erin, you know the French, they're really rigid, they're really inadaptable, they're so focused on the structure and timeliness of things that it's really unsettling for them if you change things at the last minute.
So you have to understand that what you perceive about a culture might say more about you than the intrinsic qualities of that culture.
Exactly.
So in a sense, the big piece of advice you're giving is the hardest, which is know yourself. know how you perceive things and how that is a bias that you need to try to overcome?
Putting yourself in someone else's shoes, being curious and humble, I would say are the three things that are most important when you're working internationally. Now, I can't do much to help people be humble or curious, but with the culture map, I hope to help people be able to put themselves in other people's shoes so they can see not just how do I view them, but how do they view me.
Erin Meyer, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Fareed.